Good evening, one and all. We welcome you all to the international webinar series on holistic health, well-being and sustainable development 2022-2023, commemorating Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, nation celebrating 76 years of independence, India's G20 presidency, United Nations Sustainable Development Goals 2015 to 2030, as part of awareness and campaigns in collaboration with Sri Holistic Health Foundation India and Sri Research Institute Center for Art, Sciences and Wellbeing. Before we start our sessions, let's take the blessings of Almighty.
Kurutvam kalyanam आरोग्यं धनसम्पदः शुभं कुरुत्वं कल्याणम् आरोग्यं धनसम्पदः शत्रुबुद्धिविनाशाय दीपज्योतिर्नमोऽस्तुते दीपज्योतिर्नमोऽस्तुते शुभं कुरुत्वं कल्याणम् आरोग्यं धनसम्पदः शुभं कुरुत्वं कल्याणम् आरोग्यं धनसम्पदः
With the blessings of Almighty, we shall continue with today's session. Today, we are commemorating International Day for the Eradication of Poverty on 17th October. With the theme for 2023, Decent Work and Social Protection, Putting Dignity in Practice for All. The International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, celebrated annually on October 17, aims to promote understanding and dialogue between people living in poverty and the wider society. This year's theme draws on first-hand testimonials showing that those trapped in extreme poverty, often working long, grueling hours in dangerous, unregulated conditions, but still cannot earn enough income to adequately support themselves and their families. This year's theme calls for the universal access to decent work and social protection as a means to uphold human dignity for all people and to emphasize that decent work must empower people, provide fair wages and safe working conditions, and fundamentally recognize the inherent value and humanity of all workers. Similarly, universal social protection is urgently needed to guarantee income security for everyone, prioritizing society's most vulnerable members. The theme is also a call to political leaders and policymakers to use the human dignity as a guiding compass in all decision-making process to ensure the advancement of fundamental human rights and social justice over the pursuit of corporate profits. Strong global partnerships between governments, business, and civil society organizations are vital to achieving an equitable development and ensuring no one is excluded or left behind. Therefore, this year's observance is a chance to stand in solidarity with the people living in poverty, truly listen to their daily struggles and renew commitments to create a just economy focused on protecting human and environmental well-being over maximizing financial gains. The ultimate goal is to eliminate poverty entirely by creating conditions for everyone to live with dignity. Extreme poverty is defined as a surviving on less than $2.15 per day at 2017 purchasing power parity. By the end of 2022, 8.4% of the world's population, or as many as 670 million people, are expected to live in extreme poverty. On an estimated 7% of a global population, around 575 million people, could still find themselves trapped in extreme poverty by 2030. In response to the cost of living crisis, 105 countries and territories announced almost 350 social protection measures between February 2022 and 2023. In a world characterized by an unprecedented level of economic development, technological means, and financial resources, that millions of people are living in extreme poverty is a moral outrage. Poverty is not solely an economic issue, but rather a multidimensional phenomenon that encompasses a lack of both income and the basic capabilities to live in dignity. Persons living in poverty experience many interrelated and mutually reinforcing deprivations that prevent them from realizing their rights and perpetuate their poverty, including dangerous work conditions, unsafe housing, lack of nutritious food, unequal access to justice, lack of political power, limited access to healthcare, and so on. As the world embarks on the third decade for the eradication of poverty, an estimated 783 million people lived on less than $1.90 a day. In 2013, compared with 1.867 billion people in 1990. Economic growth across development countries have been remarkable since 2000. With faster growth in GDP per capita and advanced countries, economic growth has fueled poverty reduction and improvements in living standards. Achievements have also been recorded in job creation, gender equality, education and healthcare, social protection measures, agriculture and rural development, and climate change adaptation and mitigation. Multiple crises set to plunge more children into poverty. The number of children without access to social protection is increasing year on year, leaving them at risk of poverty, hunger, and discrimination, according to a new report by the ILO and UNICEF. While pre-pandemic global poverty rates have been cut by more than half since 2000, the COVID-19 pandemic could increase global poverty by as much as 500 million people, or 8% of the total human population. In April 2020, the United Nations issued a framework for the immediate socio-economic response to COVID-19. Created the Secretary General's UN COVID-19 Response and Recovery Fund. Before the pandemic, significant progress had been made in alleviating poverty in many countries within Eastern and Southeastern Asia, but up to 42% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa continued to live below the poverty line. So what is poverty? Poverty entails more than the lack of income and productive resources to ensure sustainable livelihoods. Its manifestations include hunger and malnutrition, limited access to education and other basic services, social discrimination and exclusion, as well as the lack of participation in decision-making In 2015, more than 736 million people lived below the international poverty line. Around 10% of the world population pre-pandemic was living in the extreme poverty and struggled to fulfill the most basic needs like health, education, and access to water and sanitation, to name a few. These were 122 women aged 25 to 34 living in poverty of every 100 men of the same age group, and more than 160 million children were at risk of continuing to live in extreme poverty by 2030. According to the most recent estimates, in 2015, 10% of the world's population, or 734 million people, lived on less than $1.90 a day. Southern Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa are expected to see largest increase in extreme poverty, with an additional 32 million and 26 million people respectively living below the international poverty line as a result of the pandemic. The share of the world's workers living in extreme poverty fell by half over the last decade, from 14.3% in 2010 to 7.1% in 2019. Even before COVID-19, baseline projections suggested that 6% of the global population would still be living in extreme poverty in 2030. Missing the target of ending poverty, the fallout from the pandemic threatens to push over 70 million people into extreme poverty. 1 out of 5 children live in extreme poverty, and the negative effects of poverty and deprivation in the early years have ramifications that can last a lifetime. In 2016, 55% of the world's population, about 4 billion people, did not benefit from any form of this social protection. Poverty and Sustainable Development Goals, ending poverty in all its forms, is the first of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The SDG's main reference to combating poverty is made in Target 1.A, ensure significant mobilization of resources from a variety of sources, including through enhanced development cooperation, in order to provide adequate and predictable means for developing countries, in particular least developed countries, and to implement programs and policies to end poverty in all its dimensions. The SDGs also aim to create sound policy frameworks at national, regional levels based on pro-poor and gender-sensitive development strategies to ensure that 2030, all men and women have equal rights to economic resources, as well as the access to basic resources, services, ownership, and control over land and other forms of poverty, inheritance, natural resources, appropriate new technology, and financial services, including microfinance. Measuring poverty. There has been marked progress in reducing poverty over the past decades. According to the most recent estimates, in 2015, 10% of the world's population lived at or below $1.90 a day. That's down from 16% in 2010 and 36% in 1990. This means that ending extreme poverty is within our reach. However, the decline has slowed. In April 2013, the World Bank set a new goal to end extreme poverty in a generation. The new target is to have no more than 3% the world's population living on just $1.0 a day by 2030. By measuring poverty, we learn which poverty reduction strategies work and which one does not. Poverty measurement also helps developing countries gauge program effectiveness and guide their development strategy in a rapidly changing environment. The Global Action 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development promises to leave no one behind and to reach those furthest behind first meeting the ambitious development agenda require visionary policies for sustainable, inclusive, sustained and equitable economic growth supported by the full employment and decent work for all, social integration, declining inequality, rising productivity, and a favorable environment. In the 2030 Agenda, Goal 1 recognizes that ending poverty in all its forms everywhere is the greatest global challenge facing by the world today and an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. While progress in eradicating extreme poverty has been incremental and widespread, the persistence of poverty, including extreme poverty, remains a major concern in Africa. The least developed countries, small island developing states in some middle-income countries, and countries in situations of conflict and post-conflict countries. In light of these concerns, the General Assembly, at its 72nd session, decided to proclaim the third United Nations Decade for the Eradication of Poverty, 2018 to 2027. The objective of the third decade is to maintain the momentum generated by the implementation of Second United Nations Decade for the Eradication of Poverty, 2008 to 2017, towards poverty eradication. Further, the third decade is also expected to support in an efficient and coordinated manner the internationally agreed development goals related to poverty eradication, including the Sustainable Development Goals. Department of Economic and Social Affairs, DESA, in 1995, the World Summit for Social Development held in Copenhagen identified three core issues: poverty eradication, employment generation, and social integration, in contributing to the creation of an international community that enables the building of secure, just, free, and harmonious societies, offering opportunities and higher standards of living for all. Within the United Nations system, the Division for Social Policy and Development, SPD, and the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, DESA, acts as a focal point for the United Nations Decade for the Eradication of Poverty and undertakes activities that assist and facilitate governments in more effective implementation of the commitments and policies adopted in the Copenhagen Declaration on Social Development and further initiatives on social development adopted at the 24th Special Session of the General Assembly. International Day for Eradication of Poverty through Resolution 47 by 196, adopted on 22nd December, the General Assembly declared 17th October as the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. The observance of the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty can be traced back to 17th October 1987. On that day, over 1,000 people gathered at the Trocadero in Paris, where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed in 1948 to honor the victims of extreme poverty, violence, and hunger. They proclaimed that the poverty is a violation of human rights and affirmed the need to come together to ensure that these rights are respected. These convictions are inscribed on a commemorative stone unveiled that day. Since then, people of all backgrounds, beliefs, and social origins have gathered every year on October 17 to renew their commitment and show their solidarity. Let's watch few short videos.
8 years left to end poverty and hunger, to halve global emissions. It didn't start out as planned. We're not moving in the right direction. Years of progress lost in the pandemic. Escalating conflicts, climate breakdown. So where are we now? For decades, we successfully fought poverty. Now it's on the rise again. 1 out of 10 suffer from hunger, more people than ever forced out of their homes. Climate disasters increasing. Droughts alone estimated to displace 700 million people by 2030. This year, CO2 emissions hit a new record. At this rate, annual emissions will be 14% higher in 2030. Meanwhile, fossil energy receives $700 billion in subsidies from governments.
Your government.
Safe water and sanitation not made accessible fast enough. Progress must quadruple to cover all people by 2030. Women are held back at all levels. At this pace, by 2030, 825 million children won't have secondary level education. Human rights, health, and equality all hurt in the wake of war and disaster. Disrupted economies, food and energy crisis, and galloping costs of living damage global solidarity. Everything interconnected. Everyone intertwined. Business as usual won't cut it. Even though we made progress before, going back to pre-pandemic ways is not enough. We need a new paradigm built on the pillars of our 17 goals. Rethink conventions, flip the orthodoxies. Governments, organizations, corporations, citizens of the world, snap out of it. It's time for bold climate action. To act for women and girls, for social justice and inclusion. Scale up the transition to renewable energy. Create 85 million green jobs. Phase out fossil fuel subsidies and tax carbon. $2.8 trillion. Keep your promises. Support developing nations. Write off debts. Free up $1 trillion for climate resilience, people and communities. $500 billion for Africa to achieve universal energy access by 2030. Commit to a circular economy now. New, resilient food systems. They can cut waste by 17%. Strengthen domestic financial institutions. Make insurance and banking accessible to everyone. Scale up the digital transformation to educate the 1.6 billion kids who missed school in the pandemic. Educate girls, including the 130 million not in school now. Ensure women's equal share of decision-making. Eliminate discrimination against female workers and boost productivity by 40%. We cannot afford to leave anyone behind. We have a to-do list. We have the resources. 8 years to reach our goals. We're on this planet together. So let's work together. Let's get the list done.
You okay? You need a minute? Cool. Okay. Listen up, people. I know a thing or two about extinction. And let me tell you, and you'd kind of think this would be obvious, going extinct is a bad thing. And driving yourselves extinct? In 70 million years, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. At least we had an asteroid. What's your excuse? You're headed for a climate disaster, and yet every year governments spend hundreds of billions of public funds on fossil fuel subsidies. Imagine if we had spent hundreds of billions per year subsidizing giant meteors. That's what you're doing right now. Think of all the other things you could do with that money. Around the world, people are living in poverty. Don't you think helping them would make more sense than, I don't know, paying for the demise of your entire species? Let me be real for a second. You've got a huge opportunity right now. As you rebuild your economies and bounce back from this pandemic, this is humanity's big chance. So here's my wild idea. Don't choose extinction. Save your species before it's too late. It's time for you humans to stop making excuses and start making changes. Thank you.
Today, we are in the situation, though we are not able to foresee or visualize or prioritize where we are heading towards. Today, it is the grim situation that we are moving towards our own extinction. We are digging our own graves, and that's through poverty, through disasters, through various developmental activities that are creating a havoc in the world. So we need to move to sustainable development goals. We need to move towards sustainable development, where we need to put an end to this circular economy, or this better called as commercial circular economy, to make more profits, to make more production, rather than having sustainable and judicious production and supply and consumption. Otherwise, soon humans will also become extinct in no time. And the story repeats. The animals and birds will rule over the planet and will live happily forever. Now, it's we, the humans, to decide whether we have to be part of this planet or not to be the part of this planet. Our informed decision will help us to make decision whether to be part of the planet along with the process of sustainable development, or to become extinct and be the part of extinct species following this devastative, destructive development with destruction of nature and environment. And because more and more people are moving towards poverty, And there is a huge gap between haves and have-nots, where we see the world's richest people on one side, and we see the people, a large number of people, millions and millions of people are in poverty, and hundreds and thousands of people dying across the world due to hunger. Is most unfortunate where the world is producing 6 times than required, is not able to feed its population, and people are dying with hunger, is the most unfortunate and is the most aspect, a shameful act or a thought for the entire population on the planet. So let's the policy makers, decision makers, take a decision where at least to prevent hunger deaths and to prevent the extreme poverty of the majority of the people. When we look at the background of this observance of the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, which can be traced back to 17th October 1987, on that day, over 100,000 people gathered at the Trocadero in Paris, where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed in 1948 to honor the victims of extreme poverty, violence, and hunger. They proclaimed that poverty is a violation of human rights and affirmed the need to come together to ensure that these rights are respected. These convictions are inscribed in a commemorative stone unveiled on this day. Since then, people of all backgrounds, beliefs, and social origins have gathered every year on October 17th to renew their commitment and show their solidarity with the poor. Replicas of the commemorative stone have been unveiled around the world and serve as a gathering place to celebrate this day. One such replica is located in the Garden of United Nations headquarters and is the site of the annual commemoration organized by the United Nations Secretariat in New York. Through Resolution 47 by 196 adopted on 22nd December 1992, the General Assembly declared 17th October as an international day for the eradication of poverty and invited all states to devote the day to presenting and promoting as appropriate in the national context concrete activities with regard to the eradication of poverty and destitution. The resolution further invites the intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations to assist states as they request in organizing national activities for the observance of the day. And they request Secretary General to take with existing resources the measures necessary to ensure the success of the day's observance by the United Nations. 17th October presents an opportunity to acknowledge the efforts and struggle of people living in a poverty, a chance for them to make their concerns heard, and a moment to recognize that poor people are the first ones to fight against poverty. Participation of the poor themselves have been at the center of the day's celebration since its very beginning. The commemoration of October 17th also reflects the willingness of people living in poverty to see their expertise to contribute to the education of poverty. Building sustainable future requires us to intensify our efforts towards eradicating extreme poverty, discrimination, ensuring that everyone can fulfill their human rights. The full participation of the people living in the poverty, particularly in the decisions that affect lives and communities, must be at the center of policies and strategies to build a sustainable future. In the way, we can guarantee our planet and our societies can fulfill the needs and aspirations of everyone, not only those of privileged few, for this and future generations. Therefore, it is an appropriate that theme chosen by the United Nations in consultation with people living in poverty and civil society organizations recognize that all people must come together to end poverty and discrimination in order to build a sustainable future in which the needs of a present are met without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Accelerating global actions for the world without poverty, in its resolution 72/233, the General Assembly proclaimed the third United Nations decade for the eradication of poverty, 2018 to 2027. It also considered that the theme of third decade to be reviewed at its reviewed at its 73rd sessions should be accelerating global actions for a world without poverty, in line with the 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development. The core of the present report consists of an interagency, system-wide plan of an action for poverty eradication to coordinate the efforts of the United Nations systems, as well as the recommendations concerning how to make the third decade effective. Sustainable Development Goal 1. End poverty in all its forms everywhere, eradicating extreme poverty for all people everywhere by 2030 is a pivotal goal of the 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development. Extreme poverty, defined as surviving on less than $2.15 per person per day at 2017 purchasing power parity, has witnessed remarkable declines over recent decades. However, the emergence of COVID-19 marked a turning point, reversing these gains as number of individuals living in extreme poverty increased for the first time in generation by almost 90 million over previous predictions. Even prior to pandemic, the momentum of poverty reduction was slowing down. By the end of 2022, nowcasting suggested 8.4% of world population, as many as 670 million people, could be still living in extreme poverty. This setback effectively erased approximately 3 years of progress in poverty elevation. If current pattern persists, an estimated 7% of the global population, around 575 million, could still find themselves trapped in extreme poverty by 2030, with a significant concentration in sub-Saharan Africa. A shocking revelation in the resurgence of hunger levels to those last observed in 2005. Equally concerning is the persistent increase in food prices across a large number of countries compared to the period from 2015 to 2019. This dual challenge of poverty and food security poses a critical global concern. So poverty has many dimensions, but its causes include unemployment, social exclusion, and high vulnerability of certain populations to diseases, disasters, and other phenomena which prevent them from being productive. There are many reasons, but in short, because as human beings, our well-being is linked with each other, linked to each other. Growing inequality is detrimental to economic growth and undermines social cohesion, increasing political and social tensions, and in some circumstances, driving instability and conflicts. That's why we should care of other people's economic situation. Strong social protection systems are essential for mitigating the effects and preventing many people from falling into poverty. The COVID-19 pandemic has both immediate and long-term economic consequences for people across the globe. And despite the expansion of social protection during the COVID-19 crisis, 55% of the world population, about 4 billion people, are entirely unprotected. In response to the cost of living crisis, 105 countries and territories announced almost 350 social protection measures between February 2022 and February 2023. Yet, 80% of these were short-term in nature, and to achieve the goals, countries will need to implement nationally appropriate, universal, and sustainable social protection systems for all. Your active engagement in policy making can make a difference in addressing poverty. It ensures your rights are promoted and that your voice is heard. The intergenerational knowledge is shared and that innovation and critical thinking are encouraged at all ages to support transformation change in the people's lives and communities. Governments can help create an enabling environment to generate pro-productive employment and job opportunities for the poor and the marginalized. The private sector has a major role to play in determining whether the growth it creates is inclusive and contributes to poverty reduction. It can promote economic opportunities for the poor. The contribution of science to end poverty has been significant. For example, it has enabled access to safe drinking water, reduced deaths caused by waterborne diseases, and improved hygiene to reduce health risks and to unsafe drinking water and lack of sanitation. If current trends continue, 575 million people will still be living in extreme poverty, and only 1/3 of the countries will have half their national poverty levels by 2030. Despite the expansion of social protection during the COVID-19 crisis, over 4 billion people remain entirely unprotected. Many of the world's vulnerable protection groups, including the young and the elderly, remain uncovered by statutory social protection programs. The share of government spending on essential services such as education, health, and social protection is significantly higher in advanced economies than in emerging and developing economies. A surge in action and investment to enhance economic opportunities, improve education, and extend social protection to all, particularly the most excluded, is crucial to delivering on the central commitment to end poverty and leave no one behind. The global poverty headcount ratio at $2.15 is revised slightly by 0.1 percentage points to 8.5%, resulting in a revision in the number of poor people from 648 to 659 million as per World Bank. So the goal targets are by 2030 eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $1.25 a day. By 2030, reduce at least by half the proportion of men and women and children of all ages living in poverty in all its dimensions according to national definitions, implement nationally appropriate social protection systems and measures for all, including floors, and by 2030, achieve substantial coverage of the poor and the vulnerable. By 2030, ensure that all men and women, in particular the poor and the vulnerable, have equal rights to economic resources, as well as the access to basic resources, services, ownership, and control over land and other forms of poverty, inheritance, natural resources, appropriate new technology, and financial services, including microfinance. By 2030, build the resilience of the poor and those in vulnerable situations and reduce their exposure and vulnerability to the climate-related extreme events and other economic, social, environmental shocks and disasters. Ensure significant mobilization of resources from a variety of sources, including through enhanced development cooperation, in order to provide adequate and predictable means for developing countries, in particular least developed countries, to implement programs and policies to end poverty in all its dimensions. Create sound policy frameworks at the national, regional, and international levels based on the poor and gender-sensitive development strategies to support accelerated investment in poverty eradication actions. The number of children without access to social protection is increasing year on year, leaving them at the risk of poverty, hunger, and discrimination, according to a new report released by the International Labour Organization and UNICEF in 2023. More than 1 billion reasons the urgent need to build universal social protection for children warns that additional 50 million children aged 0 to 15 missed out on a critical social protection provision, specifically child benefits paid in cash or tax credits between 2016 and 2020, driving up to a total of 1.46 billion children under 15 globally. Ultimately, strengthened efforts to ensure adequate investment in universal social protection of children, ideally through universal child benefits to support families to all times, is the ethical and rational choice and the one that paves the way to sustainable development and social justice. According to the report, child and family benefit coverage rates fell or stagnated in every region in the world between 2016 and 2020, leaving no country on track to achieve sustainable development goal of achieving substantial social protection coverage by 2030. In Latin America and Caribbean, for example, coverage fell significantly from approximately 51% to 42%. In many other regions, coverage has stalled and remains low. In Central Asia and Southern Asia, Eastern Asia and Southeastern Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa and Western Asia and Northern Africa, coverage rates have been at 21%, 14%, 11%, and 28% respectively since 2016. Failure to provide children with adequate social protection leaves them vulnerable to poverty, disease, miseducation, and poor nutrition, and increase their risk of child marriage and child labor. Globally, children are twice as likely as adults to live in extreme poverty. Those struggling to survive on less than $1.90 a day, approximately 356 million children. A billion children also live in multidimensional poverty, meaning without access to education, health, housing, nutrition, sanitation, or water. Children living in multidimensional poverty increased by 15% during the COVID-19 pandemic, reversing previous programs in reducing child poverty and highlighting the urgent need for social protection. Moreover, the pandemic highlighted that social protection is a critical response. In times of crisis, nearly every government in the world either rapidly adopted existing schemes or introduced new social protection programs to support children and families, but most fell short of making permanent reforms to protect against future shocks, according to the report. The report emphasizes that all countries, irrespective of their level of development, have a choice whether to pursue a high road strategy of investment in reinforcing social protection systems or a low road strategy that misses out on necessary investment and will leave millions of children behind. So today, we are also commemorating World Trauma Day. October 17th each year, with an emphasis on saving lives and who properly attend to emergency cases. The day is structured to create increased awareness about trauma and to educate the public on the ways to address traumatic incidents and deaths. Did you know that traumatic injuries have caused more deaths to people below the age of 55 than malaria, HIV/AIDS, and tuberculosis? Furthermore, over 9% of the deaths around the world are caused by traumatic injuries. World Trauma Day observes seek to lower these rates. World Trauma Day was created in New Delhi, India in 2011. This was a result of a high number of deaths caused by road accidents in the country. An estimated of over 400 people lost their lives each day to it. The day was created to reduce injuries and deaths, as well as after effects of trauma incidents in the country and the world at large. Road accidents are considered to be one of the most common causes of traumatic experiences around the world. Traumatic experiences from military operations, domestic abuse, and sexual assaults follow shortly behind. These experiences, if not handled properly, can result in victims suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. According to the accounts dating back to the 5th century BC, trauma was visible in the ancient Greece and also was reported among the soldiers during the American Civil War in the 1860s. World War II came with the developments on how trauma was conceived by many. Soldiers were then allowed to take a break from the war to clear off their heads and then return to wars later. During the Vietnam and Korean Wars, the use of talk therapy for trauma victims began to hold ground. The then Veterans Administration, which is now known as the United States Department of Veteran Affairs, started a group therapy program for PTSD victims. The commemoration of World Trauma Day, on the other hand, guarantees that people are well informed about how to cope up with trauma and avoid it when possible. The earliest trauma occurrence is in 5th BC. Herodotus tells of a Spartan commander who excuses soldiers that are out of heart to partake in wars despite their proven bravery. An early PTSD observation in London, Londoners became anxious and sleepless after surviving the Great Fire of London in 1666. The bill for creating outreach centers for Vietnam veterans with PTSD is passed into law in America in 1979. Over 300 British soldiers suffering from shock are executed for cowardice in 1910s. The observation of World Trauma Day begins in India as a way to raise awareness and curtail the incidence of frequent car accidents in the country in 2011. Parents can also cause trauma. Domestic violence trauma affects not just the victim, but also the children who witness it. Trauma is mental and psychological condition that is experienced by the victims of traumatic experiences. Shock may be experienced by traumatized people at first, followed by denial and disbelief. They may also have trouble concentrating on tasks. Some people may become needlessly furious and experience mood swings, worry and anxiety as a result of traumatic events. Some people may even retreat altogether from society. Among other things, a traumatized person can develop disorders such as PTSD. Aside from that, a traumatized individual is at high risk of becoming addicted to drugs or alcohol, or as she resorts to taking them to forget the traumatic experience. World Trauma Day can be commemorated by educating the public about the causes and effects of traumatic events. This will enable people to become aware of any trauma they are experiencing and seek assistance. Engage in a conversation with a friend, relative, or a stranger who is traumatized. Be empathetic and kind towards them. Sharing their traumatic experience with you will relieve them of some of the weight on their shoulders and help them feel better. Since road accidents are a leading cause of trauma, push for better road conditions. Additionally, encourage proper road usage. Advocate for better road conditions. Approximately 8 of every 100 people are bound to experience PTSD at some point in their lives. Women have higher chances of experiencing PTSD as compared to the women and is more prevalent in women. And opposed to popular beliefs, for every PTSD victim experiences flashbacks. Flashbacks are not absolute markers. Showing face-to-face support to PTSD victims helps them feel better. Sending love from far away. Physical love elevates it. The duration of having PTSD is relative to the number of times a victim is exposed to a particular traumatic event. So World Trauma Day broadens our understanding of trauma and teaches us how to respond to emergencies. It educates the general public on how to care for traumatized victims on varieties of levels. On World Trauma Day, one of the activities is to remind people about the importance of better trauma care. This will allow them to receive better care. Parts of the effects of trauma are anxiety and withdrawal. World Trauma Day helps to make trauma victims feel love and care. Today is also commemorated as Black Poetry Day in the US to honor the talented African American poets, both past and present. If you are a literature enthusiast, poet, or writer, no matter your race, you'd absolutely love Black Poetry Day when you can celebrate Black heritage and history. Black Poetry Day is celebrated in commemoration of the birth of the man popularly referred to as father of African American literature, Jupiter Hammond, the first published Black poet in the United States of America. Today is also commemorated as Child Poverty Day, which is also referred as an International Day for Eradication of Poverty. It is a time that highlights child poverty that exists even in developed nations. Apart from lagging in necessities such as food, fresh water, and child poverty also includes lack of quality healthcare, education, and nutrition. When parents are unable to afford these, the child begins to suffer, and more than it is the job of government institutions to offer such necessity free of cost to empower the youth and build the future of the nation. Celebrate the day, spread information regarding the child poverty across the world. Today is also commemorated as Day of Dignity in Bolivia. Bolivia gathered to commemorate the victims of 2020-2003 oil revolt in an event called the Day of Dignity, observed on October 17th every year. In a march that turned deadly for many, indigenous Bolivians protested the shipment of their nation's oil to the United States. Evo Morales, the former president of Bolivia, issued a proclamation declaring a national holiday to honor and remember those fallen. Bolivia's oil reserves were discovered back when the country was Spanish colony, but suffered from a lack of exploration. The more solemn activity commenced only during the 20th century, and oil production peaked in the country, and oil became all-important export, and government pegged its hopes on gas profits to boost the country's economy. Today is also commemorated as National Clean Your Virtual Desktop Day in US. There are exactly 365 days in a year, yet most of us neglect the condition of our computers. Technology is more advanced than ever, so you have become accustomed to not to maintaining them. Thanks to the good folks at the personnel Thanks to the good folks at the Personal Computer Museum of Ontario, Canada, has changed on the third Monday of October. On October 17th this year, people celebrate National Clean Your Virtual Desktop Day by doing just making their desktops are clean. Today is also commemorated as National Edge Day in US. The straight edge lifestyle means refraining from alcohol, drugs, and tobacco. So, a subgenre of hardcore punk rockers inspired this movement. On October 17th, celebrated National Edge Day by resetting your mind and body and exploring a unique way of life. If you always have like the straight edge, there is also a great time to encourage your friends. Today is also commemorated as National Pasta Day. Hundreds of years of Italian tradition go into simple meal. Pasta comes in many shapes and sizes, but no matter the form, it's something nearly every American family has grown up. Today is also commemorated as National Payback a Friend Day in US. After conducting an in-depth study on how money affects relationships, Bank of America designated October 17th as National Payback a Friend Day. This study, which is called the Friends Again report, found that 53% of its particulars have ended. The day, which is called the Friends Again report, found that 53% of its participants have ended a friendship after they loaned a friend money and were never paid back. As a way to combat this issue, National Payback a Friend Day was created. So on October, put away the bad feelings, pull up your mobile payment apps and can start paying back. Today is also commemorated as National Pharmacy Technician Day in US. Pharmacies are busy places. Pharmacy technicians perform vital duties in the support of pharmacists, counting pills, entering patient data, waiting on customers, and explaining the use and effects of drugs and medical devices. Pharmacies couldn't run without them, and they deserve a day of appreciation. Today is also commemorated as Pro-Life Day of Silent Solidarity in US. On third Tuesday of October, It is conducted every year on third Tuesday of October, falling on October 17th this year. So it's a day for us to remain silent and in remembrance of the children who have lost their voices as a result of abortion. And today we are also commemorating Wear Something Gaudi Day. We are ready to pull out all the stops if you are already wanted to show off some of the more bizarre items in your closet. This is where something Gaudy Day first came into the existence through 1970s. True to its character, he proposed where something Gaudy Day as a result to celebrate outland fish fashion. The Lorry Dollars, played by Richie Clean, was a used salesman and flashy womanizer who forward frequently lies with identity. One of the gaudiest trends to came about in modern history was the Y2K fashion on the late 90s and early 2000s, which popularized the celebrities like Paris Hilton and Britney Spears and Regina George in Mean Girls. Embellishments, including brightly colored tracksuits, were everywhere. To put it plainly, it was a fantastic time for gaudy fashion. Finally, today is commemorated as Women in Military Service for America Memorial Anniversary in US, while Women in Military Service for American Memorial Anniversary, celebrated as October 17th, is a special day that pays tribute to the millions of military women who have lost their lives in the service. Men aren't the only saviors during the war, and the US history includes many females who contributed to the success in the combat. These military women use their intellect and strength to protect the nation and are seen as inspirational figures today. This year, honor these brave women by paying a special tribute to their accomplishments in times of war. When we think of the armed forces, it is natural to think men fighting to save the country. However, the fact is that for generations, many strong and courageous women have been sacrificed their lives to the country. Initially, women were found as nurses or cooks in war camps, but later they too became a part of the combat. Believe it or not, women in the US have been part of armed forces since 1970, and several ladies lost their lives without their efforts being recognized by the world. Some even had to fight disguised as men besides their husbands in the American Revolutionary War. Although the initial design of the memorial became an open secret, which resulted in controversies and a revision of the design, in the end of an intriguing structure with a mixture of neoclassical and modern architecture was built for the brave women who lay in the memorial. Loretta Perfectus Waltz became America's first official enlisted woman of any service when she joined the Navy. Colonel Ruby Bradley was United Nations Army Nurse Corps officer, a prisoner of the Japanese in the World War II, and one of the most decorated women in the US military. Milunka Savic CMC is the most decorated female combatant in the recorded history of warfare. The number of women veterans comprise of 10% of the total veteran population in US. Julia Kevens of the Women's Army Corps died at the age of 111, oldest known woman veteran. Almost 84% of the female veterans are of working age 17 to 64 compared to 55% of male veterans. The first 20 women of the Corps, they were known as the Sacred 20 and led by Esther Hassan. Alaska is the US state with the highest concentration of women veterans in its population. Many times the achievements of women in the Army are ignored. The day remembers the women who have lost their lives while fighting for the US. The day is an example of how anything is possible. If you believe in it, fighting wars and defeating the enemy through tactical strategies is not a reliant or in gender. Ever thought of fighting on a war, picking up a weapon? Well, this day is a great example on how many other women have remained fearless till their last breath. It's a reminder of women's resilience. Anyway, wars needs to be avoided at any cost because it's a huge loss of life and property and also causes a lot of disasters. But at the same time, if it is unavoidable, women had played a great role. So with this, we shall end the commemorations. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this wonderful day. We request everyone to fill in the feedback form, which has been raised in the form of polls. Before you leave the platform, thank you, everyone. Once again, see you all tomorrow at the same time. Take care. Good night.